I drove up to my farm driveway like any other morning, expecting the usual quiet. The sun was just starting to rise over the fields, the mist hovering above the crops, birds chirping in the distance. I could almost hear the sound of peace settling over the land. And then I saw them, 10 bulldozers, lined up like soldiers on parade, blocking every inch of the driveway. My stomach dropped, and my mind immediately went into overdrive. Had I misread the notice from the HOA? Did they really think they could just show up and stop me from entering my own property? I parked a safe distance away, my heart hammering in my chest. I sat there for a moment, staring at the absurdity of it all. 10 massive machines, diesel engines humming, shadows stretching across my driveway. I could feel the tension in the air like the calm before a storm. Neighbors might have seen the scene and called it a nightmare. For me, it was almost funny, absurd, ridiculous, but undeniably serious. The HOA had clearly decided to flex whatever little power they thought they had. I stepped out of my truck slowly, my boots crunching against the gravel, trying to calm my own nerves. I had faced challenges before, but nothing like this. A wave of anger rose in me, hot and immediate, but I pushed it down. If I reacted too quickly, too aggressively, I might give them the satisfaction. They needed to understand in the most dramatic way possible that they were messing with the wrong person. I walked closer to the nearest bulldozer, taking in every detail. The operators were sweating, shifting uneasily in their seats, trying to appear confident. I couldn't help but notice the way the sun reflected off the metal, making the machines look even more menacing than they already were. I could see the faint fear in the eyes of some of the operators, even as they attempted to hide it. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. I didn't even have to scroll through contacts. One call, one simple call, and the dynamics of this entire confrontation would shift completely. I didn't make it yet, though. First, I needed to understand my enemy, assess the situation. The HOA members had made a mistake, one that would cost them more than they imagined. They had underestimated me. They didn't know about the property, the connections, the sheer size of the land I controlled. They thought this was just a petty power struggle, a battle over a driveway. They were wrong. I glanced around at my farm, at the open field stretching beyond the bulldozers, at the barn where the horses were already stirring. It all felt calm, almost serene, and yet the tension was unbearable. I could hear the engines of the machines, low and threatening, as if mocking me. I imagined how the situation would look from a distance, a lone farmer facing 10 massive bulldozers, a ridiculous David versus Goliath scene. But I didn't feel small. I felt in control. I knew things they didn't. After a moment, I walked back to my truck, leaning against it, pretending to be casual while my mind raced. I thought about how far this had gone. A letter demanding I pave the driveway, small fines, petty rules about landscaping and mailbox colors. It had escalated too quickly. The HOA had taken a normal disagreement and turned it into a spectacle. I could hear the whispers of neighbors, probably watching from behind fences, phones out, waiting for something dramatic to happen. Little did they know, the drama was just beginning. I finally made the call, the one call that would set the wheels in motion. It was calm, deliberate, and almost polite, as if nothing extraordinary were happening at all. And yet, behind that politeness, there was a plan, a strategy, a quiet warning to anyone who thought they could intimidate me. The bulldozers weren't going anywhere, at least not until I decided they should. As I ended the call, I looked at the machines again, and for the first time, a slow smile spread across my face. They didn't know it yet, but they had just stepped into territory they shouldn't have. They thought this was a battle over a driveway. They didn't realize it was a battle over everything. The calm morning air suddenly felt heavy with suspense, the quiet of the farm hiding the storm that was about to break. I turned back to my truck, ready for the next move, knowing that every second counted. They had no idea what was coming. And that was the moment I understood fully. This was no ordinary confrontation. It was the beginning of a war, and I intended to win. The HOA called a board meeting, and I decided to attend. Partly out of curiosity, partly because I wanted to see how far their arrogance could stretch. When I arrived, the room smelled of instant coffee and self-importance. The walls were lined with charts and rules, each one more ridiculous than the last. It was clear that the people running this organization thought they were in charge of the entire universe, not just a neighborhood. I took a seat in the back, folding my arms, pretending to be a casual observer. The president, the kind of person who radiates control but really just radiates ego, launched straight into a lecture. "Your driveway is a hazard," she said, "and your mailbox color violates Section 12B, subsection 4. I almost laughed. Hazard. My driveway had been there for 20 years, and the mailbox, bright red, standing proudly like a beacon of freedom. She didn't get to tell me how to express myself. I listened patiently as they rattled off fines, rules, and warnings. Each one felt more absurd than the last. I could see the other board members nodding as if this were serious business, and I imagined how ridiculous they must look to anyone outside the room. I kept my expression calm, letting them finish, because if I reacted too soon, they might think they had power over me. The truth was, I didn't just own this farm. I controlled far more land than they could imagine. And that fact alone made everything they were doing laughable. At one point, the president leaned forward, pointing a finger at me. "We have authority here," she said, voice shaking slightly. "And you will comply." I smiled, just a small, controlled smile. Inside, I was already calculating my next moves. "Authority," I thought. "You really have no idea." I decided to drop a hint. Casually, as if mentioning it in passing, I said, "I imagine you might not realize that my property stretches beyond this neighborhood, beyond the county line even. I have interests that reach well past this little meeting room." Their jaws nearly hit the floor. The room went quiet. You could almost hear the collective processing of the thought. What did he just say? I leaned back in my chair, sipping my water calmly, as if nothing remarkable had happened. The president recovered quickly, trying to regain control. "That's irrelevant," she said. "You still have to follow our rules." I chuckled quietly, a sound that was more a warning than amusement. It was clear they were struggling to reconcile their imagined power with the reality they were suddenly confronted with. I could see the doubt forming in their eyes, the uncertainty that only grows when someone has been underestimated for too long. I let them continue, nodding occasionally, pretending to consider their points seriously. In reality, I was mapping out everything in my head. Who controlled what, how fast I could mobilize my allies, how quickly the bulldozers could be removed without anyone getting hurt. It was almost like watching children trying to build a castle out of sand while a storm quietly approached. At one point, a board member muttered something under their breath about taking legal action. I raised an eyebrow. Legal action? They hadn't realized that while they thought they were operating within some small, confined authority, I had the leverage to turn the situation entirely on its head. I could almost feel the tension in the room, a slow tightening as the realization sank in. The meeting dragged on, full of self-importance and misguided confidence. I stayed calm, observing, calculating, and letting them reveal their true colors. Every word they spoke, every gesture they made, confirmed that they had no clue what they were dealing with. Finally, after what felt like hours, the president dismissed the meeting, thinking she had asserted control. As I walked out, I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. They had tried to intimidate me with rules, letters, fines, and meetings, but their own overconfidence had done more to reveal their weaknesses than anything I could have done. I glanced at the parked bulldozers waiting at the edge of my property. Tomorrow, they would make their move again, and I would be ready. I took a deep breath and looked out over my land. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the fields. The calm before the storm was almost tangible. They thought they had power. They thought they could dictate what happened on my property. They were wrong, and I intended to show them just how wrong. As I drove back home, my mind raced through plans and contingencies. The meeting had been more than a battle of words. It had been reconnaissance. I knew exactly how far they were willing to go, how desperate they were to assert control, and most importantly, how easily they could be outmaneuvered. The suspense of the next day, the moment when the first bulldozer would move, when the entire blockade would start to unravel, made my pulse quicken. I knew that once that moment came, everything would change. And so, as the sun set behind the hills, I felt a strange mixture of amusement and anticipation. They thought this was a normal power struggle. They had no idea it was about to become a lesson in respect, ownership, and patience. The next chapter was coming, and it would be far bigger than anything they expected. The next morning, I pulled up to my farm driveway again, expecting something, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight that greeted me. 10 bulldozers. Every single one of them lined up like a metallic wall, engines idling, the air thick with diesel fumes. It was surreal. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and even considered that maybe I had stepped into some alternate reality where the HOA had somehow gotten hold of heavy machinery. I parked my truck a safe distance away, heart racing but mind clear. I took a deep breath and let the absurdity of it sink in. 10 machines, each one capable of leveling acres of land, all pointed directly at me and my driveway. The operators shifted nervously in their seats, glancing at one another as if expecting some sort of divine intervention. I almost laughed aloud, but I knew I had to stay calm. Humor was my shield and patience my weapon. I stepped out, boots crunching on the gravel, and let my eyes sweep across the scene. Each bulldozer seemed alive, looming, threatening. I imagined how ridiculous it must have looked from the perspective of someone driving down the road. A lone farmer standing in front of 10 massive machines, looking entirely unbothered. It was a scene straight out of a bad action movie, and I was the calm, unflappable protagonist. The operators tried to appear confident, revving the engines slightly as if the roar could intimidate me. It didn't. I studied each one of them, noting their hesitation, the sweat forming on their brows, the subtle glances exchanged. They were professional enough to follow orders, but not professional enough to understand the mistake they had made. They had underestimated me. Badly. I walked slowly toward the nearest bulldozer, hands tucked in my pockets, appearing casual. Inside, my mind was racing, calculating every possible scenario. How fast could they move? What were their escape routes? Which allies could arrive in time if things escalated? Every detail mattered. The tension in the air was almost tangible, and I could feel the eyes of the operators on me, trying to gauge whether I was nervous, scared, or bluffing. They were about to find out I was none of those things. As I stood there, I glanced at the other machines, noting the angles, the distances, and the slight gaps between them. A plan began to form, simple yet effective, relying on patience, observation, and a little psychological pressure. I could already sense the panic creeping into their expressions, the internal debate. Do we start pushing him off or wait for backup? They didn't know that backup had already been called, quietly and efficiently, without any of them noticing. I pulled out my phone, scrolling just enough to look casual, not rushed. The number was ready, and one call would change everything. But I didn't make it yet. First, I wanted to let them stew a little, let the absurdity of the situation weigh on them. Let them realize in small increments that their confidence was built on nothing but air. The longer they waited, the more their own anticipation worked against them. The sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows of the machines across my land. The light reflected off the metal in blinding streaks, almost like a warning. I could hear the faint hum of engines and the quiet chatter between operators trying to mask fear with authority. I let them talk, let them wonder. I didn't rush. The calm before action is always the most powerful moment, and I intended to savor it. I finally stepped back to my truck, leaning against it casually, pretending to be unfazed, while internally every nerve was alert. I imagined how this would look from the neighbor's perspective, peeking from behind fences, phones out, recording the showdown. Little did they know the real drama hadn't even begun yet. This was just the setup. The real game, the part where I would turn the situation completely on its head, was about to start. As I glanced once more at the lineup of bulldozers, a slow, confident smile spread across my face. They thought they were in control. They thought 10 machines could intimidate me. They had no idea that control was already mine in ways they couldn't comprehend. And when the first move was made, when the first bulldozer shifted under my plan, the entire illusion of power they had built would crumble in an instant. And in that moment, standing in front of 10 massive machines, I realized something. This wasn't just about a driveway anymore. This was about respect, about boundaries, about teaching a lesson to people who had forgotten how to measure their own arrogance. The suspense was thick, the tension almost unbearable, and I knew that the next few hours would decide the course of this entire conflict. But I was ready, completely ready. I stepped back from the lineup of bulldozers and pulled out my phone. The number I dialed was simple, but the effect it would have was anything but. While the operators were trying to look tough, a quiet force was beginning to mobilize behind the scenes. Allies, people who understood the scale of my property and the lengths I was willing to go to defend it, were now on their way. I could almost feel the tension in the air shift, even before they arrived. I watched the operators nervously, pretending to scroll through my contacts. I let them stew for a few moments, letting their imaginations run wild. What could a lone farmer do against 10 bulldozers? They had no idea. The suspense was intoxicating. Every twitch, every glance between them told me they were beginning to question their confidence. The first rule of intimidation is to appear unshakable, and I was doing just that. While I waited, I took stock of my surroundings. The farm stretched out behind the bulldozers, endless fields, barns, and fences all under my control. The sun reflected off the metal machines, casting long shadows that danced across the gravel. Birds chirped, oblivious to the tension. The calmness of the morning made the situation feel even more surreal, almost cinematic. It was like watching a standoff in a movie, except this was real life, and I had the upper hand. My allies began arriving quietly. Trucks carrying extra equipment, tractors, even a few farmhands with experience handling heavy machinery slipped into position without drawing attention. The bulldozer operators glanced around, sensing movement, but unsure what was happening. Their attempts to appear confident were crumbling, subtle hints of worry flickering across their faces. Every second, I could see their resolve weakening. I stayed calm, leaning against my truck, sipping water as if nothing extraordinary were happening. Internally, my mind was racing, plotting every move. One bulldozer at a time, each would be repositioned, cleared, or neutralized, and by the end, the blockade would be gone, leaving the HOA completely humiliated. The suspense was electric. I could almost hear the imagined whispers of neighbors, hiding behind fences, waiting for something to happen. Little did they know, they were about to witness a masterclass in strategy. The operators tried to call their superiors, probably hopping for backup, but they had no idea what they were up against. Every call, every decision was being countered in subtle ways they couldn't see. While they thought they were in control, they were actually playing into my hands. The more desperate their attempts became, the clearer it became that they had underestimated me. Badly. I stepped closer to the nearest bulldozer, pretending to casually inspect the machine. I let them hear my footsteps crunching on the gravel, each step calculated to unsettle without provoking. The operators shifted uneasily, revving engines to compensate for their nervousness. I smiled quietly. Fear is contagious, and I was about to spread it very effectively. With the calm confidence of someone who knows the rules and owns the territory, I finally made my move. One of my allies, hidden until now, slowly guided the first bulldozer backward, using the operator's hesitation against him. The machine shifted slightly, and the operator's eyes went wide. I didn't move a muscle. I let the tension stretch, savoring the suspense, letting them wonder if it was just a fluke. I glanced at the other machines. One by one, the domino effect would begin. The operators tried to communicate, shouting orders, but it was too late. The seeds of doubt had already been planted. While they argued among themselves, I stayed calm, a silent conductor orchestrating the chaos. The suspense was unbearable, and I knew the moment the first domino fell, everything else would follow. And then it happened. The first bulldozer, the one I had subtly shifted, moved fully, clearing part of the driveway. The operator tried to react, but the momentum, combined with my quiet strategy, made it impossible to stop. The others froze, watching, realizing their confidence was crumbling in real time. My heart raced with anticipation, not from fear, but from the thrill of knowing I had turned the tables. The sun reflected off the metal machines, casting long, dramatic shadows, and I smiled quietly to myself. They thought they had the upper hand. They had been wrong. The suspense, the tension, the uncertainty was reaching its peak. And I knew that by the end of the day, the entire blockade would be gone, and the HOA would understand just how outmatched they had been. Standing there, calm and collected, I understood one thing clearly. They had underestimated me, and that mistake would cost them more than they could imagine. The game was no longer about a driveway. It was about control, strategy, and patience, and I intended to win. The first bulldozer had moved just a little, but it was enough. The operator's face twisted in confusion, panic flickering in his eyes. The other operators froze, unsure whether to act or wait for some miracle to happen. I stayed calm, leaning against my truck, sipping water, watching the tension ripple across the machines like a slow-moving storm. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the turning point where the illusion of their power began to crumble. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The sunlight glinted off the metal of the bulldozers, casting long shadows over the gravel driveway. It was almost cinematic, like some overdramatic movie scene, except it was real. The operators tried to rev their engines louder as if noise could intimidate me. It didn't, not even a little. The calm confidence I carried was my real weapon, and they couldn't touch it. I glanced around my property, letting my eyes sweep over the fields, the barns, the fences, all under my control. The sheer size of the land seemed to press down on the scene, reminding everyone exactly who had the upper hand. The operators shifted uneasily, the hum of engines almost nervous now, betraying their uncertainty. They didn't know the land, the rules, or the reach of my influence. They didn't know what it meant to cross someone who controlled more than just a driveway. With deliberate steps, I moved closer to the nearest bulldozer, hands relaxed, expression calm. The suspense hung in the air, heavy and thick. I could see them trying to anticipate my next move, voices low, muttering to one another, a mix of confusion and dread. One of the operators glanced nervously at another and asked, "Should we just leave?" I almost laughed. Leave. Too late. The first domino had already started falling, and the rest would follow whether they wanted it to or not. My allies were in position now, hidden from view, ready to act when the moment came. Quietly, efficiently, the first bulldozer was guided farther back, out of the way. The operator's hands shook on the controls, and I stayed calm, letting him experience every second of the suspense. The other operators were starting to sweat, realizing that the carefully constructed blockade they thought would intimidate me was unraveling before their eyes. I could almost hear their thoughts. How did he do this? What can we do? The uncertainty was delicious. The more they hesitated, the more control I had. I let the pause stretch, watching as tension built to a breaking point. The longer the suspense, the more their panic grew. I wasn't rushing anything. Patience was part of the strategy. Timing, precision, and quiet confidence would win this standoff far better than brute force ever could. One by one, I began to move the other bulldozers in subtle ways, each shift deliberate and careful. The operators tried to respond, but it was too late. Momentum had already shifted, and they were scrambling to regain control that no longer existed. I could see their frustration mounting, the beginnings of panic setting in. Neighbors might have watched in disbelief if they had been close enough to see. 10 massive machines, slowly being outmaneuvered by a single farmer, calm and collected, with a plan no one else could anticipate. The sun was climbing higher, casting sharp, dramatic shadows, making the entire scene feel surreal. The suspense was unbearable, thick with the possibility of disaster, yet I walked among the machines like a conductor, orchestrating chaos with a quiet hand. I didn't shout, I didn't threaten, I simply moved, calculated every step, and let the operators experience their helplessness. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the last bulldozer shifted. The driveway, once completely blocked, now had a small but clear path. The operators stared at one another, unsure whether to continue or retreat. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed, smiling just enough to remind them that the game was over and they had been outmatched. The suspense of the moment was electric. The realization had settled in. They had underestimated me, underestimated the land, underestimated the calm patience that comes with knowing exactly how to win. The first real battle of this confrontation had been decided, and they had lost. And as I watched them, sweat dripping, faces pale, I felt a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and quiet amusement. I glanced across the farm one last time that morning, letting my eyes take in the fields, the barns, and the fences. The machines were no longer a threat. The blockage had been broken. The message had been sent. I knew the next steps would require even more strategy, more patience, and more subtle pressure. The suspense wasn't over, far from it. The real test, the true climax of this standoff, was yet to come. Standing there, calm and composed, I understood one undeniable truth. In a battle of patience, preparation, and confidence, arrogance is always the first casualty. And the HOA was about to learn that lesson in a way they would never forget. The morning sun was high, casting harsh light across the farm, and the tension had only thickened. The bulldozers, once a solid wall, were now scattered, each one partially repositioned, but the operators were still desperate to regain control. I could feel their panic radiating like heat from the engines. Every glance, every nervous twitch told me they were beginning to understand that this was not a simple blockade anymore. It was a chess game, and I was 10 moves ahead. I walked slowly along the driveway, boots crunching on the gravel, letting them see me, letting them wonder what my next move would be. The suspense hung in the air like a living thing. The operators tried to rev their engines louder as if noise could intimidate me, but it only highlighted their desperation. I smiled quietly to myself. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know that patience, calm, and quiet strategy could overpower any number of machines. My allies moved carefully, silently behind the scenes. One by one, each bulldozer was nudged, guided, or slowly repositioned. I stayed calm, acting as though nothing extraordinary was happening, but internally I was calculating every step, every timing, every possible reaction. The operators shouted, tried to communicate, waved their hands, but the longer they hesitated, the weaker their confidence became. Suspense was a weapon, and it was slicing through them like a knife. I glanced around at the fields, barns, and fences, taking in my domain. Every inch of this land was mine, and the operators could feel it even if they didn't understand it. The power of ownership, of knowing the rules and having control, was invisible yet undeniable. They were trapped in a situation they had thought was simple, and it was unraveling before their eyes. One of the operators tried to move his bulldozer forward aggressively, hoping to intimidate me into retreat. I raised a hand casually, not in threat but in observation, and the hesitation in his eyes was immediate. The machine shuddered, stalled, and then moved slightly backward under subtle guidance from my allies. The confusion and fear on his face was almost comical. I suppressed a chuckle. This was no longer a standoff. It was a lesson in humility. Neighbors had begun to peek from behind fences, phones raised, capturing every absurd moment. I didn't mind. The suspense was amplified by their presence. Watching 10 professional operators lose confidence while a single farmer orchestrated every move quietly was, frankly, a little surreal. Every shift of a bulldozer, every nervous glance, every muttered word added to the tension. The entire scene felt like a carefully directed drama, and I was both actor and director. As the morning wore on, I began to move the remaining bulldozers systematically. One operator tried to coordinate with another, but the more they talked, the more confused they became. The subtle guidance from my allies, combined with my calm presence, was unraveling their strategy piece by piece. Engines roared, levers shifted, and each tiny movement sent waves of suspense through the group. The chaos was building, but in a controlled, deliberate way that worked in my favor. The president of the HOA arrived, flustered, shouting from a distance. She tried to assert authority, waving papers, threatening fines, and legal action. Her words were drowned out by the roar of engines, the shifting of machines, and the silent knowledge that she had no leverage here. I didn't move, didn't flinch, but I let her see the first seeds of panic in the operator's eyes. Suspense is amplified when those in charge appear powerless, and her presence only intensified it. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was only minutes, every bulldozer had been subtly repositioned. The driveway was nearly clear, a narrow but usable path emerging through the chaos. The operators looked at one another in disbelief, unsure if they were still in control or if the farmer in front of them had somehow rewritten the rules. I remained calm, walking slowly along the path, surveying the machines, savoring the tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. And then I realized something. The suspense wasn't over. In fact, it was reaching its peak. The operators were fully aware now that they had been outmaneuvered, but they didn't know the full extent of my plans yet. The true climax of this standoff, the moment that would finally tip the scales entirely in my favor, was still ahead. The first part of the battle was over, but the war was just beginning. Standing there, boots firm on the gravel, I felt a quiet thrill. They had underestimated me, underestimated the land, and underestimated the patience and strategy of someone who knows exactly what they own and how to defend it. The suspense had been maintained perfectly, and the next steps promised even more drama, even more tension, and even more satisfaction. I smiled quietly. They had no idea what was coming next. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the full weight of the situation had finally hit the HOA. Their confidence, which had seemed unshakable just days ago, was crumbling right in front of them. The bulldozers were no longer a threatening wall, but a scattered, awkward reminder of how badly they had misjudged me. I stood in the middle of my driveway, arms crossed, calm and deliberate, letting them stew in their confusion. The suspense was electric. They had no idea what was coming next. The HOA president, red-faced and flustered, stomped forward, waving her papers like a tiny flag of defiance. "This is unacceptable," she shouted. "You can't just ignore the rules." I looked at her calmly, taking a slow, deliberate breath, letting the moment stretch. She was frantic, trying to assert authority that had already slipped from her grasp. I allowed a small smile to form, letting her feel the imbalance of power. She didn't realize it yet, but she was standing in the territory of someone who literally controlled more than she could comprehend. I decided it was time for the reveal. Calmly, I began explaining the extent of my holdings. My voice was steady, deliberate. "I own this farm, yes, but it doesn't stop here. The land stretches far beyond this neighborhood, beyond the county line. Permits, zoning, access, all of it falls under my control. The rules you've been trying to enforce here, they don't apply." The room went silent. You could almost hear the collective processing of the statement. Eyes widened, jaws dropped. Murmurs erupted among the operators and the board members. I let them digest it. Suspense is more powerful when it lingers, and this was pure, delicious tension. The operators shifted nervously in their seats, glancing at one another, clearly trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I was. Every word was true, every claim backed by decades of property and influence. They had crossed someone who knew exactly how to wield power quietly and effectively. "What do you mean it doesn't apply?" The president stammered, voice tight with panic. I took a step closer, slowly, letting my presence dominate the space. "I mean exactly what I said. This land, these roads, even the infrastructure beyond your little rules, I control it. Legally, completely, and strategically. Any action you take against me is not only pointless, it's dangerous." The operator's hands froze on the controls, every lever suddenly heavy, every decision fraught with risk. I glanced at the neighbors who had gathered silently behind fences. The suspense was reaching a climax. 10 massive bulldozers, operators frozen, a frantic HOA president, and me, standing calm and collected, narrating the reality they had all ignored. The scene was surreal, almost cinematic. I could see them realizing the scope of their mistake. Their egos, carefully inflated by imagined authority, were collapsing in real time. Then came the final move. One by one, I instructed my allies to guide the bulldozers back, not as a threat, but as a demonstration of control. Engines roared, metal shifted, and the machines obediently aligned according to my plan. Every operator's face reflected disbelief and panic. The path through my driveway was fully clear. The blockade that had once seemed impenetrable was gone, dismantled not by force but by strategy and ownership. The suspense was overwhelming. The president tried to shout, tried to claim some semblance of authority, but her words were drowned by the reality she was now facing. She could see the scope of my land, the coordination of my allies, and the calm precision of every move I had made. The lesson was clear, and it didn't require shouting. My presence, my calm, and the unfolding sequence of actions had already spoken louder than any argument. I stepped back, surveying the cleared driveway and the defeated faces of the operators and board members. The tension lingered, a heavy, palpable thing in the air. They had underestimated me, underestimated the land, and underestimated the patience and cunning required to reclaim control. The suspense had been maintained, built carefully over days, and now it reached its peak with the undeniable truth of victory. As I looked across my fields, the sun casting dramatic shadows over barns and fences, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The first part of the war, the standoff, was over. They had learned a hard lesson: never misjudge someone who knows the rules, owns the land, and has the patience to let tension and suspense work in their favor. The grand reveal had been made. The balance of power had shifted permanently. And in that moment, I knew that the final part, the closure, the resolution, and the satisfaction of seeing my driveway fully secured, would be even sweeter. The suspense had been maintained perfectly, the lesson delivered without violence, and the HOA would never forget the day they tried to block me. The bulldozers were gone, the driveway was clear, the sun was high, casting warm light over my farm, and a quiet stillness had returned. After days of tension, suspense, and absurd theatrics, the battle was finally over. I walked along the gravel path, boots crunching softly, taking in the sight of my reclaimed driveway. The smell of diesel lingered faintly, a reminder of the chaos that had just unfolded. The HOA president was retreating in the distance, red-faced and muttering under her breath. She had finally realized that she had crossed someone who didn't just own a farm, but wielded control over more land than she could comprehend. The operators, 10 of them, shuffled away like schoolchildren caught in the act of something they didn't fully understand. The comedy of the situation wasn't lost on me, but I stayed calm, savoring the victory without gloating. Patience, strategy, and quiet confidence had won the day. Neighbors began emerging from behind fences, phones in hand, capturing the aftermath. Some shook their heads, others whispered in disbelief, and a few came forward to congratulate me quietly. Their admiration was a quiet validation that I had handled the situation with precision. The suspense, the build-up, the drama, they had all witnessed it unfold like a perfectly timed story, one they wouldn't soon forget. I walked up to the nearest operator, now sheepish and pale, and offered a small nod. "It's just land," I said calmly. "You should have checked the rules before blocking it." The humor in my voice didn't go unnoticed. The tension was still thick, but laughter, quiet and restrained, began to ripple through the onlookers. The absurdity of 10 massive bulldozers defeated by a single person, calmly and efficiently, was almost cinematic. The president approached, shoulders slumped, papers flapping uselessly in her hands. She tried one last feeble attempt to assert authority. You can't just," she stammered. I raised a hand, polite but firm. "I've explained. The rules you think you enforce do not apply here. Any future attempts will be handled exactly the same way. Consider this a friendly warning." Her silence was confirmation enough. She understood fully, even if she wouldn't admit it out loud. I glanced across the farm, letting my eyes sweep over the fields, barns, and fences, all calm and intact. The morning chaos had resolved into a quiet, satisfying order. The tension of the past few days lifted slightly, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. Every move I had made had been calculated, each step deliberate. The suspense had been maintained perfectly, leading to this satisfying moment of triumph. And yet I couldn't help but chuckle quietly. The absurdity of the situation, the idea that 10 bulldozers, supposedly a wall of intimidation, could be outmaneuvered by a single farmer, was too ridiculous to take entirely seriously. It was a story that would be remembered, retold, and probably exaggerated in local legend. Neighbors would whisper about the day the HOA tried to block me, and how I had quietly and efficiently shown them who really controlled the land. As I walked to my truck, I thought about the lessons of this standoff. Patience is more powerful than panic. Strategy is more effective than force. And knowing your own strengths, your rights, and your resources can turn even the most intimidating situations in your favor. The suspense, the tension, the planning, it all mattered. It wasn't just about clearing a driveway. It was about teaching a lesson without unnecessary conflict, about showing that knowledge and calm can outperform brute strength. I climbed into my truck, glanced one last time at the cleared driveway, and started the engine. The diesel smell, the distant hum of retreating machines, and the sun on my face all felt like the perfect punctuation to a long, suspense-filled chapter. The neighborhood might never forget this day, but more importantly, I wouldn't either. The power of quiet confidence and calculated action had been proven once again. As I drove down the driveway, leaving the chaos behind, I smiled. The entire confrontation, from the initial shock of 10 bulldozers to the final clearing of the path, had been a masterclass in suspense, patience, and subtle humor. The story was complete, the lesson delivered, and the victory undeniable. The HOA had learned in the most dramatic way possible that some battles aren't won by size or intimidation. They're won by strategy, calm, and knowing exactly what you control. And with that, the farm was peaceful again. The driveway was mine. The land was mine. And the lesson had been learned, loud and clear, even if the HOA didn't want to admit it. The suspense was over, but the story, I knew, would live on forever. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.